Hello, it's Dr. Tirrell. I just wanted to post this video to bring everyone up to speed about where we are in the course and where we're going in the future. Of course, we're doing this because of the the course cancellations. We didn't have class last week, and then of course with the storm, we didn't have it this week as well. So I did want us to go ahead and take a look at the calendar, make sure everyone's up to speed. And then also just chat a little bit about the subject that we would have covered today in class, having to do with reading television as a cultural text. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. Let me just say, though, of course, if anyone's still having any kind of difficulty with the weather, with transportation, or anything like that, just make sure you contact me so we can address any problems you have. It's not a big deal. I need to know about it. So I just need you to email me, and we can fix any issues you're having. Let me shift this over to the calendar so we're not staring at me. Apologize, it kind of looks like a mug shot. I've got this spotlight on me here in my home office. So let me just make sure that that's, yeah. So this is the calendar for right now. We should have reading response in. Not everyone has done that, I noticed. That's okay. I mean, with the weather, it's strange. I mean, technically, we don't even have class today, so I'm not going to grade that right away. Go ahead and submit that when you have an opportunity, so that you get credit for it. It pertains to our readings here about Gantz. Is not there's anything wrong with that. The critical reading of Seinfeld through the lens of queer theory, and then Reinhardt's Sex Sells, critical reading of Sex and the City through a Marxist lens, and then general information about writing about television. So that's where we are right now. Today we would have spoken about those things. We're going to address that in a little bit. As I say, if you haven't had a chance to complete reading response 4, please make sure you do that as soon as you can. So that I can give everyone appropriate credit. So for Thursday, we do have the draft of our analysis essay due. This is, we've gone through this process before, so it's very much what we did for the previous essay. As it says, and you will make a new thread where you'll upload a draft of your analysis essay as an attachment. I noticed last time not everyone attached it. They just sometimes copied and pasted it. That's not ideal. It is preferable to do it as an attachment. The only caveat there is sometimes folks couldn't open the program because it was in something they didn't have. So a good example is if you have a Mac and you use Pages, not everyone can open that. The way to handle this is just export it as a PDF. Everything can do that. So just export it as a PDF and then attach it. We want to do this by class time on Thursday, even though it's a out of class period, so that we can use the time during the rest of the day to respond, because we will be doing peer review. As before, what you're going to do is you're going to select a post that has fewer than 3 comments. The idea there is so that everyone gets appropriate comments, from a range of people. Then you'll read the attached draft and choose one of the 4 rubric criteria listed below you believe is its strongest and one you believe is its weakest. Some folks didn't exactly do this last time, but that's what we are asking you to do, or I am asking you to do. It's the royal we. So look through these criteria, select the strongest and the weakest, and then explain those choices, right? What we're trying to do is give the person an understanding of what is effective in the current draft and where improvements could be made. So, do what the prompt asks, please. Select the rubric criteria that is the strongest and the one that is the weakest for that draft, and then explain those choices in the document. You want to do this for 3 of your classmates' drafts, so you'll do 3 comments. By and large, people did this fine last time. The main thing was not everyone actually followed the prompt and selected the criteria that are strong and weak. So do make sure you do that. So that's what's going on for Thursday. You want to post this before class time, which is 12:30, and then you want to go ahead and give comments on 3 drafts by the end of the day. Remember that out of class periods the assignments for those periods are due by midnight of the same day. Classes are scheduled to resume tomorrow, Wednesday. So everything should be, going on Wednesday and Thursday. So you want to make sure you post your draft by class time, which is 12:30, and then complete the associated peer review by the end of the day. If you have any questions or problems or anything, just email me and we can resolve it. I will see you folks on the 18th. And as before, we're going to do small conferences. The schedule is the same, just I didn't want to, with all the cancellation and all the this and that, I didn't want to rock the boat. So it's just the same schedule. That means, as before, you only come in for a 15-minute block. So you just find your name, see what time period you're associated with, and you only come in for that period. There were, 1 or 2 missteps last time, which is to be expected. It's the first time we did it. But now we all know how this works. So that's how next Tuesday is going to work. I will send you an email reminder on Monday. It's on my calendar, so that everyone recalls that this is what we're doing. You want to make sure to fill out your conference preparation form before you do that. This one's slightly different than the previous one because it's a different genre, right? So you're going to state the assertion about the world around you revealed by the cultural text you have chosen. Essentially, that's your thesis. That's what we're asking here. That's what I'm asking here. Why do I keep doing that? And then the other questions are similar but different. They're slightly revised from the previous one. So consult the information from your draft comments and your own thoughts about your essay. You're going to be getting back peer comments on Thursday, of course. What do you think is the strongest aspect? Right? So what do you think you're doing well at this time? And then the flip side of that, what's most in need of improvement? And then what's the next concrete step in finishing things up, right? So this will prep us for finishing up this essay. I'm going to be giving you feedback as well, of course. So we do want to be aware that that's what's happening in the coming couple of weeks. The course schedule, it's fairly regular. We go through the same sort of process for most of the semester. So, just stick to the calendar, just stick to what we did before, and things are kind of the same. Now, if you have any questions or anything, you can email me and we can resolve them. You can come into office hours. That's Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 4. Remember, that's on the syllabus. TNR means Tuesday and Thursday. I always assume people know that from registration, but then I always get questions about it. It's Tuesday and Thursday, 2 to 4. Okay, so that's what's coming up in the next week. Not a big deal. It's stuff we've done before. You want to just make sure you stick to the calendar, and I will send email reminders. So the other thing, let's go ahead and talk a bit about today's subject. We're not going to go over this a lot because it's a video. It's really not appropriate to the genre. But there was a lot of interesting stuff here, and I did want to talk about it a bit. People have made some interesting comments. So reading response 4, the first question is, why might Seinfeld be a particularly good subject for Gantz? Is this indicated in her essay? So this was an interesting essay, as the book pointed out, and it had those annotations as it went, right? Those little sections in blue that sort of walked you through it. This is a scholarly work primarily, so it is speaking to a specialist audience. It is using a lot of sources. And what that means is it's not necessarily going to bring everybody up to speed. It's not for a general audience. That said, whatever a general audience means, that's not even a real thing. It is more sort of broadly accessible because it talks about its lens, queer theory, before it applies it. And for this situation, that was kind of necessary because at the time this was being written and in that particular sort of subfield, readers would need lead up. They wouldn't necessarily know, well, what do you mean by queer theory? Since then, it's become a lot more, and she alludes to this in her essay, a lot more sort of not standardized, but common. It's built up its own sort of body of critical work and where it's been applied. And as people pointed out in their responses, when we're talking about queer theory, and she addresses this in her text, it's not as though, let me cut back to myself just for a second here. It's not as though, what she's saying is everything is actually about homosexuality, right? I mean, she explicitly points out that's not what she's saying there. Sometimes we think about things in those terms when we hear a reading from a particular lens, and it can reduce things seemingly to a binary where there is a literal level of plot, this is what's happening, and then there's a secret allegorical meaning that's the real truth. And some things are indeed allegories, like Yertle the Turtle, Dr. Seuss book, Yertle the Turtle. If you never read that one, it's an allegory about essentially the rise of Hitler. It's about fascism. So it's talking about this fantastic Dr. Seuss stuff, but it's explicitly allegorical, referencing this other event, right? There's all kinds of things that are explicit allegories. You maybe not know this, but the television show MASH, it was a TV show about the Korean War, but it was being produced and shown during the Vietnam War. And even though it was explicitly about the Korean War, it was allegorical about the Vietnam War, because you couldn't really have a show about the Vietnam War while it was going on, because it got into the sort of the complexities and how strange war can be, and how good intentions can not necessarily lead to good outcomes, and those kinds of things. So it was allegorical. We're talking about the Korean War, but yes, allegorical, we're really talking about the Vietnam War. Dr. Seuss, yes, Yertle the Turtle is about a fantastic land and a turtle, but we're also really talking about the rise of fascism in Europe. That's allegorical, but not everything functions that way, and even allegories, that's not the only thing you can say about them, right? I mean, MASH, you could certainly look at issues of race and class, right? Even though it's an allegory, all other lenses still apply. The same thing's true about any allegory. So when we read something like the Gantz, and because it's queer theory, we might initially say, well, is she just claiming they're all homosexual and that's all this is? Not at all. What she's arguing is that if you look at things through the lens of queer theory, you can see particular issues and aspects of this that you couldn't see if you didn't look at it that way. That doesn't mean you couldn't look at it through many other lenses. That's one of the questions, right? What's another lens we could apply to something like Seinfeld? And so what Gantz is arguing isn't everyone in Seinfeld is secretly gay, or this is only a gay narrative. What she's saying is if you look at the sexual relationships, if you look at levels of intimacy and contact, you can see things, right, that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise. So that's sort of what we're getting at here. And that's the issue of lenses that the book talks about. It doesn't mean all other lenses are wrong, or there's only one way to look at this. All those other lenses apply. It's what can you see when you apply this particular lens to this particular cultural text. So let's flop back over to your responses there. Let me make sure it's presenting. There we go. Because people had some different interesting things to say, and picked up on sort of some of the things that Gantz was articulating, or is articulating in that article. So, I asked, why is this a particularly good subject? And people had some good things to say about that. This response, and I'm not going to link this with who said it, just people maybe don't want to do that, says Seinfeld, was a good choice for Gantz to use because of the queer lens she uses. Towards the beginning of her essay, she mentions that Seinfeld, let me blow this up. Seinfeld is predominantly a male show, right? I mean, it's predominantly about males. The relationships of the males, in fact, oftentimes alienate them from women, right? She points out they couldn't write a script that included a woman because they can't really put themselves in the mind of a woman. Lots of different anecdotes like that. It sparks the question if there's any true queerness within the show. Gantz states that the term queer in relation to her analysis of Seinfeld did not mean which characters were actually homosexual, but rather which characters exhibited a certain aura of queer tendencies, right? So issues of intimacy and romance and sexuality that aren't the traditional heteronormative relationships. And what does that tell us, right? It's not really enough just to say, oh, look, they're all friends and they exclude women. I mean, what do we get out of that, right? So that's something one of your classmates said, or maybe you, about this that I think is applicable here, right? It's not who's homosexual in this. In fact, she points out that there are explicit moments where there are homosexual characters, where they address homosexual themes explicitly. But as Gans points out, it's often when it's not being addressed explicitly that we get to see more interesting things about issues of intimacy, primarily male intimacy in this television show. Another person points out that it might be a good subject because a lot of the comedy comes from relationships, sexual relationships, romantic relationships, right? And so this gives Gans a lot of examples to pull from in the essay. That's accurate. Furthermore, the relationships between characters can sometimes be seen as queer, with Kramer's, it should be a possessive, it's just a typo, occasional queerness, as well as the especially close friendships between Jerry and George. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Gans is pointing out, and that is of interest to queer theory. And if you want to think about this sort of in our own lives, you can think about your own sort of friend relationships versus what you might consider your romantic relationships, regardless of where you fall in terms of heterosexual or homosexual. We can all think in terms of our different forms of relationships and how they differently invoke or engage intimacy, right? So an easy example would be something like, if you've ever sort of thought about, would you rather, hang out with your friends and, do something your friends like to do, or hang out with your romantic partner and do something that maybe won't be as fun or relaxing? You probably have some level of intimacy with your friends, and as we can see in Seinfeld, with your, in that case, same-sex friends, because we're talking about heterosexuals. Same-sex friendships have a kind of intimacy that the romantic relationships don't have. It doesn't mean they're better or worse, or deep and shallow, or true and false necessarily, but there are different forms of intimacy that are invoked in these relationships, and that's what she means by homosocial, right? There are ways, for example, that I can talk to my male friends that I've had since childhood that I will never be able to talk to my wife, of 13 years now. We've been together longer than that. And it's not a limitation, it's just the relationship is different, right? We have different forms of intimacy in these different relationships. So that's exactly what we're talking about. Those kinds of things you can see by applying queer theory. And what does that imply about the status of those relationships in culture? Other people talked about this in some of their responses, different kinds of points in culture. For example, someone pointed out that Seinfeld was, let's see, it's wildly popular. Let me see if I can. A wildly popular show that influenced many other TV shows in the process. So that's something that's important, thinking about, why should we apply this lens and get these aspects out of this show? Well, because it had a lot of effect on popular culture, and therefore, mainstream American culture. A lot of other shows were influenced by this, either explicitly or not. It was just sort of part of the landscape. Consider if shows with, explicitly homosexual characters, Modern Family is a good example, that comes up a lot. Will and Grace, which is similar in terms of kind of the genre. How do those function in terms of mainstream culture? And, these kinds of issues are really sort of always at play when different aspects of what we might call minority cultural groups get appropriated or utilized in mainstream culture in different ways. I mean, that's why it's important. You folks are probably old enough to remember, the term metrosexual, right, which had this notion of males who took on aspects of gay culture, interest in fashion, interest in different aspects of high culture, those kinds of things. The term itself invokes that. And so it was an instance of mainstream culture appropriating a minority culture, and that's complicated. It happens a lot. I mean, it happens with African American culture all the time in America, with gay culture. Metrosexual is a good example. An example like disco music. Not everyone knows this, but disco music came out of gay nightclubs. I mean, pretty much directly. And it became very popular as sort of mainstream music. And there was this huge backlash against that, not just because of the way the music sounded, and what they were talking about. If you ever listen to disco music, it's completely anodyne. It's not offensive at all. But culturally, there was a kind of unease with, it seemed like it was emasculating in some way, that gay culture was getting this kind of legitimation, and that happens all the time with mainstream appropriation of minority cultural aspects, and how there's a give and take with that, right? So people addressed that in Gantz's work, and sort of what it says on a larger context, rather than how does it apply to our viewing of Seinfeld. Moving on, because I don't want to drag this on too long. It's a great subject. It's just I know watching a video for 30-40 minutes is draining. I asked folks about other lenses you could apply to this, because of course you can apply any lens to anything. They're not always equally productive, and sometimes you can get more out of one lens than another, but you can always give it a try, right? So folks pointed out a lot of really applicable lenses here. I think a lot of folks mentioned class, right? Seinfeld could be analyzed through the lens of class, because the show implicitly asserts that its content is intended for a middle-class audience, and that middle-class everyday people are the most relatable and humorous, at least in this geographical region. And that's definitely something people talked about. Class issues, I mean, everybody's doing fine in Seinfeld, and nobody really works, Is the life depicted there like our lives? Not necessarily, but it kind of establishes this is what normal life is, right? And so that resonates with us in different ways, the way we talk with each other. But, I was growing up in Oklahoma. That wasn't my life, but in some way, the relationships that they had, I think that did filter into, my understanding of what adulthood was like, what sort of adult life was like. Yeah. So class, that happens in Friends as well, the television show Friends. Nobody works, and everybody's, oddly wealthy. No one's ever destitute, Uh-oh, I think Charlie's having her bath. It's my toddler. We'll power right through here. Let's see. So other folks talked about race, right? And other shows like that 70s show where issues of race are kind of, in one sense, elided. There are rarely non-Caucasian people in the show. One primary person, Fez, I believe, in that show is not Caucasian, but that's often, played in kind of a one-dimensional way, right? I mean, look at how odd the non-white person is, right? So issues of race pop up a lot in here. Someone pointed out a little bit further that there's 4 main characters, and in a place like New York City, which is a melting pot, or it has a heterogeneous population, that's not super realistic, but it is normative. It says, well, this is how normal reality is implicitly. Somebody mentioned something really interesting about geography. Where is that one? Let's see. Yeah. If you sort of view this through the lens of the geography split between urban and rural, or urban and suburban, right? I mean, where I grew up, where a lot of us grew up, the kind of suburbs, urban and inner city, right? So thinking of geography, that's a fantastic lens. If you're viewing this through what sort of values are implied in that show versus what you get in a different geography. And then, of course, things like issues of gender. Elaine has to shoulder the whole burden of representing all femalehood, basically, because more or less Every other female character is either just kind of a response to one of the male characters, somebody Jerry is dating, right? Or someone like a parent, Jerry and George's moms. And so you have this dichotomy of, because they both have unusual relationships with their moms, George's is, almost antithetical, and Jerry is very much a mama's boy. And so there aren't a whole lot of, rich roles for women. I mean, famously, George's fiance is just kind of killed off. She's just an object, Anywho, so gender is certainly something that you could use to apply. You might think of other lenses as well, religious norms. Seinfeld has a really rich relationship with religion in that it's both present but also really hidden, Jerry is Jewish, but it's not really overt. When it is sort of overt, it's how Judaism fits into the larger milieu of Christianity. Religion comes up with George explicitly, the idea of converting for a relationship and that kind of thing. So all of those lenses are at play, right? Moving on to the Reinhardt piece and Marxism, a lot of folks pointed out how these issues of class manifest in Marxism. I mean, that's what it talks about, is class and capital, right? That's sort of the underpinning drive of Marxism. So folks talked about the bourgeois hero that is in the Reinhardt. I mean, you might say, well, gosh, I mean, Sex and the City, isn't that all about commercialism? And I think this reading points out, well, yes, but that's weird, perhaps, that this sort of capitalist drive, again, where nobody works, but everyone is fabulously okay, right? No one would cop to being wealthy, but they're never hurting for anything. And all of the interaction takes place through consumerist activity. That's not neutral. That's a thing. That's not just sort of the default of how things are, even though it's presented as such. That is itself subjective. Doesn't mean it's bad or good. It's just, that's a thing, So folks talked a lot about that. And then when we got to other lenses here, people talked about feminism being a big issue. If you apply a feminist lens to this, what might pop out, right? There's almost a kind of inversion. Again, you've got 4 characters. They're all female here, almost an inversion of Seinfeld. You might see how females, how different women are depicted in these shows, the 2 different shows. How does that differ? Do men take on the same role in Sex and the City that women take on in Seinfeld? If not, what are the differences and how does that illuminate aspects of culture, right? So feminism certainly is a lens that could apply. Class, that's something a lot of folks talked about. Gender and class pop out quite a bit. Race, I mean, someone in here responded that, the protagonists are basically all Caucasian women. And so someone did point out, right, Samantha is seen as the hot one and, is obsessed with shopping and of course, sexuality. And when we go into the salon, for example, it's Asian. So what role do minorities play? A lot of times they are these kind of counterpoints to the fully fleshed out protagonists, right? So, I mean, those are all things to consider. One thing, I don't know if anyone mentioned it, but you could apply queer theory here as well, right? Again, it's sort of like Seinfeld. It's sort of a variation of that. What would happen if we applied Gantz's queer theory to Sex in the City? Right? What are the relationships of the female protagonists like there? Do they operate in similar ways as they do in Seinfeld? If there are differences, how do they illuminate different aspects of culture? So those are things we wanted to talk about. And again, that's just sort of a rough overview of these things. People have put some good things in the comments in reading response 4. I'm looking forward to everyone else contributing their comments. And as I addressed earlier, these different sort of lenses, that's what they do, is they allow us to get a look at something and allows us to see aspects that we wouldn't see otherwise. No one lens is going to see everything. Just like the dictionary can't define anything completely, never could. No one lens is the objective, perfect viewpoint. So we apply multiple different lenses, and we can see different aspects. I'm going to have to pay attention to that. We can see different aspects and with different lenses, yet never everything. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with you folks. And then also, let me just return to the calendar here briefly. So I'm going to have to go see what's wrong with Charlie here. She's unhappy. There we go. So do remember, we've got the draft of your analysis essay by 12:30 on Thursday. And then we're going to be, we're at DEF CON 2. Then we're going to be doing peer review with those drafts for the remainder of that day. You'll have until midnight. It won't take you that long, but you can do it on your own schedule. And then on the 18th, we do have group conferences, so you want to fill out the preparation form in advance. That's my dog now, too. Boy, when I walk out that door, it's going to be a disaster. So you want to make sure you come at your appointed time. I will send email reminders about this, particularly because of the weirdness of the classes being canceled. If you have any questions or anything like that, you can always email me, particularly if you're having issues with transportation or power outages or whatever. Just shoot me an email, and I will see you folks in class. All right.